Dig up a medieval famine grave, and the first thing you notice is what isn't there. No sword wounds, no arrowheads lodged in bone, no young men cut down in their prime. The pit is full of ordinary people, laid in fast and close together, and their skeletons tell a quieter, stranger story. Bodies that had been losing a slow fight for years before the ground finally took them. You picture the Middle Ages, and you picture a battlefield. The sword, the siege, the arrow through the throat. That's the image every story hands you, and it's wrong about what actually did the killing. Here's the problem with it. If war were the great killer of the medieval peasant, the deaths would rise in the years the armies marched and fall in the years of peace. They don't track war at all. They track the harvest. They climb after every failed crop in villages no soldier ever reached, on a cycle that returned whether or not anyone was fighting. War arrived and left. Hunger kept an appointment. So the real question was never who won the battle. It's what was waiting for the millions who never fought and won, and why it took the exact people it took. Now, here's the part the battlefield stories leave out. The medieval countryside didn't run on money. It ran on a single harvest, and everything after that harvest was subtraction. Autumn was the one honest moment of plenty. The barn full, the grain counted, the pig killed and salted down. From that peak, the line only fell. Every loaf eaten through the winter was a loaf that couldn't be replaced until the next harvest, months away. By late winter, the stores scraped bottom, and the first real food of spring still hadn't come. The countryside had a name for that stretch: the hungry gap. The weeks when a household had already been running on empty and the fields hadn't given anything back yet. And this wasn't rare bad luck. It was built into the calendar every single year. Worse in the 1310s than in living memory, when some of the coldest, wettest weather of the whole Middle Ages rotted harvest after harvest across northern Europe. In that emptying loft sat one thing a family was forbidden to touch: the seed grain. Every household held a sack of it back, dry and rustling, useless as food in the way that mattered, because it wasn't meant to be eaten. It was meant to go into the ground in spring and become the entire next harvest. To boil and eat the seed was to eat next year. In the worst stretch of the Great Famine, the winter of 1315 into 1316, that is exactly what people across Europe did. They ate the seed. And the moment they did, the following autumn's hunger stopped being a risk and became arithmetic. A starving decision made in March killed the village a year in advance. But hunger wasn't the only thing hiding in the grain. There was a passenger in the rye. Rye was the poor family's lifeline precisely because it grew where better crops gave up, pushing through cold, sour, waterlogged ground that would have rotted wheat where it stood. It was the grain that survived the bad years, which is exactly what made it dangerous. In wet seasons, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea grew on the rye heads, replacing a plump kernel here and there with a hard, curved, purple-black spur. Its shape gave it its name, ergot, from an old word for a rooster's spur. To a family sorting grain by firelight at the bottom of a bad winter, it was one more dark fleck among thousands, milled with the rest, baked, swallowed. Inside that spur was a chemistry no one could see. In one form, its toxins clamped the small blood vessels shut, choking off circulation to the fingers, the toes, the feet, until the living tissue went cold, then mottled, then black and hard. Gangrene creeping across a body still fully awake to feel it burn. They called it St. Anthony's fire. In another form, it went after the nervous system instead. Violent convulsions and hallucinations, including the specific, unmistakable feeling of insects swarming beneath the skin. To a village with no concept of a fungal neurotoxin, a person seized by it didn't look ill. They looked possessed. No one can say how many it killed. The medieval world kept no such count. But that was never really the point. The point was that the food you reached for because everything else had failed was the food most likely to turn on you. And this is the detail that changes everything. We can now say who the famine actually took because their bodies kept the record. A body does its growing once. Bone length and tooth enamel are laid down in childhood and never fully rewritten. So a child who goes hungry while still growing doesn't simply recover later. It stops short and stays short, carrying the mark of those lean years for the rest of its life. A stalled line in the enamel, a thigh bone that never reached full length. It means a skeleton is a kind of ledger. Measure it 7 centuries later, and you can still read how hard the childhood was. In 2017, the bioarchaeologists Sharon DeWitte and Samantha Yaussy read that ledger at scale, working with 858 skeletons from the cemetery of St. Mary Spital in London, a site holding both ordinary graves and the hurried mass pits dug during famines. They measured thigh bones, using leg length as a proxy for how well each person had managed to grow. Then they compared the two kinds of burial. The result was stark. The mass famine graves held a significantly higher share of short-boned individuals, the people whose growth had been stunted by early deprivation, and the pattern held regardless of age or sex. Sit with what that means. Famine didn't strike at random, and it didn't take the strongest first. It reached into a population and pulled out the people who had already been losing. The ones whose bodies had been shaped by every previous hungry winter. The child, who never reached full height because the food ran short in the wrong years, became the adult the next famine was most likely to kill. The hunger wasn't a single event that fell on the unlucky. It was a sorting machine, and it had been marking its victims since before they could walk. That was the quiet horror inside the mass grave. Not a village struck down together, but a slow cull of the already wounded running generation after generation with no enemy and no end. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody expects. Surviving the famine didn't mean you had survived the disaster. The worst of it hadn't even arrived yet, and it came on 4 legs. The same cold, sodden climate that failed the crops also fell on the animals. Between 1319 and 1320, a cattle plague swept England and Wales, and the historian DeWitte Slavin, working through the account books of manors and monasteries, put a hard number on it. Around 62% of the cattle died, and in the worst hit places, all of them. Part of the reason was the famine itself. As the grain failed, families turned to oats, the one crop that tolerated the wet, and oats had been the cattle's fodder. The people ate the animals' food, and the animals were left to starve into the path of the disease. For a peasant economy, that collapse wasn't just lost meat. Oxen pulled the plow, cows gave the milk, butter, and cheese that were the main source of protein, fat, and calcium for a poor family that rarely ate meat. When the herds died, that entire supply died with them, and the milk did not return to normal levels for more than a decade. This is the part the famine story leaves out entirely. In 2013, DeWitte and Slavin brought the skeletons and the manorial records together and found something the grain crisis alone could not explain. For a full generation, much of the English population carried a chronic shortage of protein, calcium, and vitamin B12. A slow, invisible malnutrition that outlasted the bad harvests by decades. The bread came back. The cows did not. And a body deprived of those specific building blocks doesn't just feel weak. its immune defenses quietly run down. So, the trap closes. The peasants who lived through the years of empty barns were, by definition, the survivors. The tough ones, the lucky ones, the ones who made it. And their reward was to be handed into a decade-long protein famine that hollowed out their defenses from the inside. When a new disease reached Europe a generation later, in 1347, the researchers argue it met a population that had already been softened for it. Not a random crowd, but people primed by years of quiet deficiency to lose the fight. The ones who beat the hunger may have simply been kept alive long enough to meet something worse. And it all traces back to the same cold February village. No army did any of this. The season did. Starving the fields, then the herds, then the blood itself, and returning every year for whoever was still standing. They counted the grain in autumn. They watched it fall all winter. They guarded the seed that was next year's life. They survived the empty barns and inherited the empty pastures. And then they did it all again the next year and the year after that. Tonight, when it gets cold, you'll do something automatic. You'll turn something up or pull something over you, and the cold will stop being a threat and go back to being weather. You won't count anything. You won't ration. You'll open something cold and full and never once think about March. But you're not just a person avoiding a chill. You're standing on the far side of the slow war your ancestors never got to stop fighting. The one with no enemy to surrender to, that came back every single year and thinned the village from the inside while the chronicles carefully recorded someone else's battles. We can't line up the dead and settle the score. Nobody ever kept the books that could. But the wars had names and got remembered. The winters had none and came back anyway. So here's the question worth sitting with. How much of what we call history is just the wars somebody wrote down? And how much of the real dying happened quietly, on a schedule, to people whose cause of death nobody thought was worth recording? If a forgotten history like this is worth keeping alive, subscribe, and I'll keep digging up the ones the battlefield stories left out.